energy and society, and we're really thrilled today to be able to have a talk from Lorenzo Kristov. Now, I met Lorenzo a few years ago, and for me, he kind of epitomizes the kind of person that you want to work with, you want to know, and you want to be inspired by. He's kind, he's brilliant, and he's incredibly thoughtful. In addition to having a PhD in economics from the University of California, Davis, he's also really critical of the role of economics in our decisions and the value that they purport, while being the principal market architect of the California ISO. And whenever I'm thinking about issues affecting the electricity system, energy policy, and the processes for transforming our energy system in the future, I often ask myself, what would Lorenzo do? And I'm never quite as good as when I hear him say it in real life. So I'm just really thrilled that we have him here on campus to begin to have this conversation here with all of us. So with that, I'd like to invite you up to speak, Lorenzo. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, can everyone hear? Okay, yes, I think that sounds good. Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, for inviting me to this fantastic event. It's really great to be here. I've never been to Dartmouth or Hanover before, so it was absolutely beautiful. And I enjoyed walking around today, and it's nice to be in this really lovely small town.
I told him the weather's always like this.
The weather's always like this, I understand that. You just keep the snow shovels for show, right? You don't really ever use them, except for last week, yeah. So I worked at the California ISO for 19 years almost, and went through this little mishap that happened in 2000. Some of you may have heard about that. There was a major thing where the markets broke down and didn't work very well and cost people billions of dollars, but you know, small change. And the recovery from it, which was redesigning the markets. How do we do that? Which took about 7 years to actually not only figure out how we wanted to redesign them, but then actually implement the systems. The last 3 or 4 years, I was very interested in distributed resources and thinking about what's going to happen when we have an explosion of distribution side resources of all different types, rooftop solar and batteries and vehicles and whatever else is happening. So I've been puzzling over that question for quite a long time, and at the same time started to think about resilience, because that word became an important one in the national political conversations and energy conversations. And yet it was used in a lot of different ways by different people to mean different things. So I tried to put together some ideas that connect things that I'm very interested in: distributed resources, grid architecture, which I learned about initially from my friend and collaborator Jeffrey Taft, who's at Pacific Northwest National Lab and is the chief architect there, about thinking about the power system as a whole system and what that means. And in this time of very rapid and pretty substantial change, the benefits of thinking whole system rather than looking at the compartmentalized pieces. So we've called this multi-level architectures of energy resilience, and I think it'll become apparent in a minute what that means. So starting off with resilience, what exactly do we mean by that? And I've got a picture of one of the hurricanes here in the background to suggest why we might care about it. The ability to maintain essential quality of life functions and services when a severe disruption occurs. So that's kind of I think, popular and intuitive notion of what resilience means. But it's gained currency in a lot of different venues. After Hurricane Sandy occurred in New York in 2012, it became a central theme of the REV proceeding. New York Public Service Commission started, called Reforming the Energy Vision, and it was to rethink how do we create more resilient power systems and accommodate distributed resources, and what are all the changes that that implies. It also became a concern for the Federal Energy Commission more recently. Back in December, the Department of Energy sent to FERC a rulemaking and said, we wanted you to pursue this, which had to do with essentially giving some kind of resilience credits to coal power plants and nuclear power plants in some ways a response to the fact that energy market revenues have been declining with the arrival of a lot more renewable energy, which tends to have zero production cost, marginal production cost. And so thinking about how can we give them more money, FERC considered that as a notion of resilience. The resilience idea being that these power plants can store 3 months worth of fuel on site, and so therefore they're resilient. FERC decided that was not a good idea, but they did open up a proceeding and they inquired of all the ISOs and RTOs to report back to them on a list of resilience questions and what they're doing. The US military is very interested. At the California ISO military bases in California were coming to us and asking about microgrids and exploring the economics of creating microgrids because they're under a directive to be more resilient. A lot of local communities in California are thinking about it, and with the fires that happened last year and some of the subsequent events, for example, in the Santa Barbara area, huge mudslides after the fires burned off a lot of the woods, then they had huge rains that started washing down the mountainsides. So it's become a hot topic. Generally, disruptive events, I think an important theme is that resilience always has a local component. It could be an impact that has a very wide geographic area. It could affect major infrastructure, but it's always people on the ground that have to deal with the impacts. There's always local infrastructure is destroyed and you're dealing with things that are fundamental, like supplying water and pumping sewage and shelter and food and all those things. So at least part of resilience has to be preparing to deal with those situations. And nearly all the functions that you'd need to strengthen to be resilient rely on energy in one way or another. There's another concept of resilience with regard to longer term types of disruptions, and that is what happens with gradual erosion of the economic base of an area, what happens when a major industry is in decline, for example, the coal mining areas of Western Virginia. And I was supposed to have turned this off. Wait a minute. Why didn't it? Sorry. So I'm not really going to talk about that today, but it is another way that many communities are thinking about resilience. That is what happens with these more slower, longer term phenomena. System architecture. So the architecture word was in the title. As I began thinking about the transformation of the industry that's happening through the movement to renewable generation, to distributed resources, and how that's changing aspects of the industry, I began to learn about grid architecture, and that is looking at it as a whole system. Architecture is about the structure of a complex system, and structure has a number of aspects to it, but basically it's what are the components and how do they relate to each other. And where there are particular entities that play a role in that system, what are their roles and responsibilities? This might seem like an obvious thing, but it's right now moving to kind of the center of controversy as lots more distributed resources are either coming on the system or are anticipated. And the question then is, well, we have these transmission operators that are ISOs or RTOs. In Europe, they're called TSOs. And then we have these separate entities that operate distribution systems. Here they're utility distribution companies. In Europe they call them DNOs, distribution network operators. But the question then, with lots of distributed resources, there's going to be impacts in the upward direction to the transmission system. What's the new coordination framework between a transmission operator and a distribution operator? How is that going to work? And that's an architecture question. A lot of the discussions, like 2 weeks ago, I was at FERC at a technical conference on DER aggregation. A lot of the questions go right to technical things. What kind of communication do we need? How fast do we need to get information? Who needs to send what information to whom? Well, those questions, or the answers to those questions, really ought to be consequences of architectural decisions. In other words, what are the roles and responsibilities of the different parties? But there's a tendency to go right to the technological questions and skip over the architecture ones. So my friend Jeff Taft provided these little diagrams. There's a house, which is a complex system in its own right. but there are subsystems within it. And the relations among the subsystems, one of them is electrical wiring, another one is plumbing. Those are subsystems that are essential to the house performing its desired functions, and as how all those systems fit together is part of the story. And the punchline is that if you get the structures right, then the pieces fit neatly into places. The design decisions are a lot simpler. They're consequences of what are the roles and responsibilities of the various entities? How do they carry those out? Well, then that leads you to the technology questions and answers. And investments are efficient because you're not making investment decisions that become obsolete because you didn't think through the architecture. And of course, the most important punchline, that the system works as you intended it to work. So looking now at the electric system, multi-level architecture, starts with what are the needs for electricity and the uses that we're putting it to. So the bottom few layers here, and so I'm putting a few layers together, but there's a layer that's the wires. Electricity flows over wires, but above that, there's another layer that's communications. It's sensing different things that's happening on that wire system and sending that information back and forth to different parties. And then above that, there's a controls layer. There's ways in which somebody can send some commands, or a system can send commands, like regulation service. Every 4 seconds, generators are receiving instructions to move in a certain way through a system. Now, the next layer up, industry structure, I put that in a different font color to emphasize, because that's a layer where we get into roles and responsibilities of different parties. It's worked out. The industry structure is, what is the utility supposed to do? What's the ISO supposed to do? What's the distribution operator supposed to do? Then there's a layer that's the markets and the market structure and prices and parties that are responding to economic incentives at different time frames. Then above that, there's a regulatory framework, standards involving interconnection, or standards involving how you're supposed to behave as a citizen of the grid. And there again, I put that in black font also, because that's where players, different regulatory entities, have different roles and responsibilities. We see it especially between federal regulation and state regulation, or even state regulation vis-a-vis municipal, or federal vis-a-vis municipal, or power authorities. So different regulatory entities. And then above this, there's a number of contextual layers, the federal and state laws regarding energy, as well as things like contract law and other things that are embedded in the legal system that affect energy. The political processes by which legislation gets passed and decisions are made. And then we're in a context of global ecosystems and environment that has multiple dimensions. These all start to shape it. So if we look at this as a layered whole system architecture where these layers interact with each other and affect each other, and start to ask questions about resilience, where does resilience come into play here? I just listed a few kind of basic questions that one might think about if we wanted to do a resilience assessment. What kinds of disruptions are we thinking about preparing for? That's probably going to vary regionally. What are the most critical energy-dependent services? Well, that may vary also in different jurisdictions, depending on what sorts of fuels they use to do different services. What are the impacts and consequences of disruptions? What are the desired outcomes, goals, and capabilities? What are we trying to accomplish? One of the most important things in grid architecture is to start with objectives. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? And here again, I see time again in the electricity industry thinking about the reforms, going right to, well, should we change the market structure to this, this, and this, without thinking about what is it we're trying to accomplish? What are the goals here? So starting with objectives. And then which layers should we focus on? Which are the most critical? And the ones where I've highlighted the black font, I think, are the critical ones here, in the sense that that's where decisions happen. At the regulatory framework level, we have regulatory bodies that are making decisions that are going to affect the shape of the industry. And then at the industry structure level, we have parties who have today pretty well-defined roles and responsibilities, but those need to change for the future. Simply think about a distribution wires company. When there's a large volume of distributed resources, operating their system is not the same old thing that it used to be, and we'll get into that next. So in electricity, the one-way flow paradigm, I call it, has operated with relatively small changes for nearly a century. And when you think about the 1990s with the creation of wholesale markets, that was a major change for the industry, but it didn't change the one-way flow paradigm. It was still basically electricity was flowing in one direction. You had the same kinds of power plants. It didn't really fundamentally change technologies. It just created a market competition layer, which was a new thing, and it was a big deal, but it didn't change this piece of it. So bulk electric system is where the generators and the transmission are. And that's connected to the electric distribution system by something we typically call transmission distribution interfaces, which are usually substations that step down the voltage from bulk level to distribution level. And also typically the bulk system is a network, a mesh network, where all the lines crisscross and intersect at various places, where the distribution systems are mostly radial. And then there's electricity needs and end-use customers at the end, and customer meters at those interfaces. And the key one way is energy flows only one way, the direction of those red arrows. And that's, for the most part, been generally true. So this is really just looking at the electricity system wires layer that I had in the previous diagram. Resilience, just at that layer, obviously needs to consider all these pieces, the bulk system, the interfaces, the distribution system, et cetera. But the one-way flow paradigm is not just about the physical layer. It starts there, but every element of that layer diagram I showed you on the previous slide is really shaped by that one-way flow paradigm. And it shapes the regulatory structures. It shapes how we think about reliability, or how we think about resource adequacy, how we design markets, retail rates. Basically, everything about how the industry works has been shaped by the one-way flow paradigm. And as I'll get to in a minute, major drivers of change, the obvious ones, distributed resources, renewables, are changing that paradigm and making it obsolete. So as we think about resilience, we also need to think about it in an evolutionary sense, that the system is evolving into something that's not well defined yet. Hopefully, we'll pay enough attention to grid architecture to think about it at that level. So decarbonization, I think, is the next theme to introduce here. California has pretty serious decarbonization goals, which are illustrated in this graph, where they're trying to get to by 2050 is 80% below 1990 levels in terms of overall greenhouse gas emissions. Well, the electric system in California is 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation is 42%, buildings about 35%. So it's all of these energy uses that rely on fossil fuels that are apart from the electric system itself. That's the biggest source of greenhouse gases. When we think about changing that, how is it going to play out? Well, as different elements of the state start implementing electrification programs, number one, it's going to have direct impact at the distribution level, because you think about electric vehicles, local electric transportation systems, what we're doing with buildings to, say, get them off of gas, become zero net carbon. All of that is at distribution level interconnections. So that's going to be adding at the bottom layer a whole lot more demand as we electrify these traditional fossil fuel uses. Resilience will rise in priority. My expectation is, and I think from a prudent risk management perspective, one should think that the severity and frequency of climate events is probably going to get more serious in the coming years. And something that I think is not noticed enough, and I've been bringing this up a lot in California, is that a lot of the electrification activities that need to happen really intersect with municipal planning. The general plans, or the comprehensive plans as they're called elsewhere, they deal with things like local transportation and land use and building codes and what kinds of developments do we want to approve that you build into zoning requirements and so on. These are all municipal level or county level planning activities, what I think the state misses, certainly in California, is they don't recognize that in order to accomplish the decarbonization goals, the electrification goals, there needs to be a really strong partnership with municipal governments, with local governments, bless you, that are doing these kinds of activities that are really going to make the difference. So if you think then about these aspects of it, the coming from the distribution side, coming out of local planning, electrification then is going to drive the electric system change from the bottom up. And that's a totally different world where for decades it was always policymakers at the top building big infrastructure. It was all very top down. Even the market restructuring of the 90s, it was federal law that started to drive that, and then states decided how they wanted to implement in their areas, but it was really federal law that was the driver of it. And another point that I think is often overlooked is that individual customer adoption of, say, rooftop solar, solar plus storage EVs is only part of the story. We have an economics paradigm, this is the economics I learned in school, that focuses on individual customers. Everybody's an individual utility maximizer. And so when we think about change, we want to get those individual customers to make adoption decisions that are going to change how they use energy. And if you integrate this with the idea of municipal planning, it's not just individual customers that are the key decision makers. What I would say is community level actions will really be the big game changer. Yet our economic theory doesn't have any room for community actions. It's all about the individual cost-benefit trade-off, right? So how do we bring communities into this conversation? Well, let's see what this does to our diagram. Large-scale renewables, storage, distributed energy resources are overturning the one-way flow paradigm. So there's the same pieces. I've put a little red font under end-use customers because now behind-the-meter distributed energy resources are a huge presence on the system. California's a 50,000 megawatt peak. We've already got 6,000 megawatts, which is about 12%. Of behind-the-meter rooftop solar in California. And within the next 3-4 years, that's going to double. So 25% rooftop solar capacity compared to the annual peak. That's huge. So I put that in there. You look at the boxes and the interfaces, still pretty much the same, but now the red arrows go both ways. And what we can see, not only can energy flow in either direction, but it can reverse at different times. Certainly at the household level, at the building level, at customer level, we have rooftop solar putting a lot of energy onto the grid in the middle of the day, taking it off later in the day when the sun goes down, and so on. So what does this mean? Well, on the end-use customer side, the market, you know, with the success of wholesale markets in the 90s, we've really bought into this notion of electricity as a commodity. Everything is structured in commodity terms. So we have spot markets and forward markets and hedging contracts and all kinds of things that are from the commodity world. But one way to think about the change that's happening is that there's a whole other market developing behind the meter. And that's the market for services, where customers don't really care about kilowatt hours. They don't really care about a commodity. They care about, what do I need energy for? To turn on lights, to run heat or cooling, to run machinery, to charge my vehicle, et cetera. Now, we're getting to a point where the behind-the-meter marketplace can be significant enough that any endpoint, a building, an apartment complex, a business, an industry, can think about how to meet their energy needs to a very large extent, perhaps, with equipment that's behind the meter. The grid now becomes the residual supply resource, or it becomes a place to trade our own residual energy where there may be a buyer for it. Very different concept. At the distribution level, smart cities has become something of a buzzword, with the idea being that electricity integrated with other municipal services becomes a strategy for resilience. Let's start looking at all the services we need to provide and think about that as a whole system. Not to mention that distributed resources are driving all of the distribution utilities to think about how do we need to modernize our systems. We were never designed for two-way flows. We were never designed to handle the kinds of variability that these things have. We were never designed to handle the peak output that might come off of solar on a circuit and drive an overload from the bottom up. And then at the bulk system, microgrids as a possibility. So microgrid basically is a little self-contained energy system that could exist at different scale, but the key element of its definition is that it can actually separate from the system and operate as an electrical island. So the idea of microgrids supporting resilience can do so in a way that when there's a problem on the larger system or bulk system, microgrids can take power off. They can simply remove themselves, operate reliably for their own customers, for their own loads, and at the same time relieve the grid. Also, a related theme is if you think about electrification and the demand that will be added through electrifying transportation and buildings and so on, that the shape of that demand will be really important. If we end up with really steep production profiles, like just building lots of solar down at the distribution level, well, that's going to drive operating costs and infrastructure costs on distribution and transmission. If we can shape that at the lower level, then it may be not only a less costly way to integrate large volumes of solar at the local level or electrification demand, but it may also help reduce greenhouse gas emissions simply because when extreme production profiles, the famous duck curve in California, or the short-term variability of renewable resources, when that goes up to ISO level, to bulk system level, they're typically running gas generators in order to manage it. So there's greenhouse gas impacts simply due to where you're managing the volatility. So one of the phrases I like is to manage local variability locally as far as possible. So these then become ways that the one-way flow paradigm is really being made obsolete. So, layered architecture of resilience, going back to the title. Well, here's one vision of a possible way of thinking about the future. Electrically, this looks pretty similar to the way things work today. I'm going to start with the really big blue bubble on the bottom, which is what I call a local distribution area. And that simply is all of the distribution lines and everything connected to it below a single transmission distribution interface. That has to operate as a successfully reliable unit. Even if a utility has a huge service territory, it still needs to manage each one of those little areas effectively because they're not connected to each other except through the bulk system, right? So in that level, you can have hundreds or thousands of individual households. You can have dozens or even hundreds of businesses, depending on how large and densely populated the area is. But you can also have something called a smart building, where a smart building now has microgrid properties, which means that where those yellow eggs are, there's an interface that could actually enable that element to separate from the grid. And then you could have a microgrid, which is, say, a university campus that might have a whole bunch of smart buildings in it. The microgrid can also island at that interface point. And then similarly, the transmission distribution interfaces, those are the two-way blue arrows. Those are the ones where the local distribution area could potentially island from the bulk transmission system and create what I call a layered reliability paradigm. And then the ISO is the balancing authority. They run and balance the transmission grid, and they're connected to others in the region. So ISO New England is the balancing authority. Here, they're connected to New York. They're connected to parts of Canada, I believe, and PJM is connected to MISO in New York and other places. So adjacent balancing authorities in California, the ISO is a balancing authority, but there are 38 balancing authorities that make up the Western interconnection, and they all have interfaces. Many of them have interfaces with each other. So what does this do for us, this kind of hierarchy of subsystems? Rooftop solar storage controls can form a smart building level microgrid with this islanding capability. The key thing about the layered structure is that each layer only needs to worry about its interfaces with the layers above and below. It doesn't need to see what's inside them. So you think about the idea of thousands and thousands of distributed resources all participating in the wholesale market. If the ISO has to keep track of, say, 20, 30,000 tiny resources when it runs its wholesale market, that's a very different and more complex problem than the ISO seeing one point of interconnection at that interface where the distribution utility is managing everything below it. So this layered architectural structure would say, well, let the distribution utility, or DSO is now a term that's being used, distribution system operator, let that entity be responsible for everything that's happening below the interface. And the ISO then just needs to worry about what's happening at that boundary. Then that's the layered structure. And each layer then can island and operate as an autonomous unit if necessary. The layered architecture reduces complexity in terms of controls and communication, because the ISO, for example, doesn't need to see 20 or 30,000 tiny resources. It just needs to see those interface points. Scalability as well. You can have microgrids at different levels, a building within a campus, within something else. And the fractal structure mimics how nature designs complex organisms and ecosystems. So layered architecture of resilience 2, a little bit about living systems. Here's a cell somewhere in one of our bodies that has a relationship with its environment, and it manages its own energy use, and it manages its interfaces with whatever environment it's embedded in. This particular cell is embedded in an organ, which in this case is a heart. Hey, you weren't supposed to go that fast. Slow down. My heart started pumping really fast. So that cell, you know, it looks out for its own well-being in a sense. It manages its own relationship and its own dynamic equilibrium, but it also functions as part of the organ. It needs to somehow be in sync with that organ function. Well, the organ is just one element of a body, and the body is another complex system that, again, becomes a layer. Now, the brain in that body doesn't tell every one of the cells what to do, but there are signals going through the nervous system and the endocrine system and the blood system and so on. This body of this person is also part of a family or a community, and that's another complex system, another layer. I guess waving my hand seems to do it. I'll talk with this hand. So the next layer up then would be that family is part of a community that's part of the global ecosystem, which is the Earth. And there's intermediate layers, obviously, between that. You have cities, you have countries, you have bioregions, et cetera, which I'll get to in a moment. But this layered architecture is characteristic of nature. So on to layered architecture of resilience 3, resilient community policies and strategies. I wrote a little paper on this idea of different layers of resilience that are the dark plain circles to a friend of mine who works for the World Business Academy in Santa Barbara, and he had his graphic artist make this little drawing. They used it for part of their Earth Day presentations this past weekend. But the idea is that just as there are layers in the electrical architecture we talked about, in the natural ecosystem that we talked about, the same thing can happen when we get to resilience of communities. starting with a household level, thinking about energy efficiency, thinking about making them all electric so that they're not emitting carbon, smart charging, minimizing waste, using gray water, low water landscaping, microhabitats, et cetera, things that essentially look out for the relationship between the people who are living in this house and how they interconnect with the ecosystems of nature. Go up to the neighborhood level, resilience, sharing food, community gardens, sharing cars, tool libraries. Another thing that's often overlooked, public space. How many neighborhoods, I was seeing this in my neighborhood, we have sidewalks that are like this wide. Two people can't walk down the sidewalk together. What happens if you make the sidewalks 10 feet wide or 8 feet wide? Then they become gathering spaces, benches, places for people to sit and talk. There's a guy named Mark Lakeman in Portland, Oregon, who did a lot of work in this. He traveled around the world for 5 years, looking at how different cultures create and use public space. And basically came to the conclusion that if you're going to have a democracy, you have to have places for people to gather and talk to each other. And it needs to be really easy to interact and be in the same place. So public spaces in neighborhoods is hugely important. Community energy systems, and the last item on there, shade, solar, optimal balance. That's kind of a mouthful, but you think about the rules that utilities usually have about solar panels on your roof. They want you to size the system to meet the needs of your house. Well, that sort of sounds reasonable, but it really doesn't make any sense when you think about a neighborhood, because a lot of people have shady houses and they don't want to cut down trees to put solar panels on it. So the optimal idea is look at all the solar radiation that hits the neighborhood and build solar installations that'll capture that and share it as a resource. San Antonio, Texas, a municipal utility did something like this a few years back, where they said, let's look at all the sunny rooftops and we will buy the panels as the utility, we'll put them on your house and we'll pay you rent of 1 or 2 cents or 3 cents a kilowatt hour to have these panels on your roof. And the solar panels become a resource for the utility. So thinking about things like that as community level resources, community level decision making becomes an important resilience strategy as well as economically efficient. Move to the municipality level and we get to this idea I mentioned earlier about whole system integration of municipal services, but public spaces at a next level of scale where you have public spaces around a city. Local businesses, and facilitating neighborhoods. In where I live, Davis, California, there are some neighborhoods where people are really active and they do creative projects and a lot of cool stuff happens. Other neighborhoods are not. So if we want to build resilience at the neighborhood level, there's a role for the city to start to create an entity or a person or an office that can actually help facilitate neighborhood council formation. And you start to build resilience at these different levels. At the bioregion level, thinking about food. If we're really going to be sustainable and resilient, we can't depend on food that comes thousands of miles away all the time, or we can't depend on it as much. So how do we make that more local? How do we think about waste management on the bioregion level so that we can't keep throwing stuff away? There's this gigantic island of plastic that's floating in the ocean. Habitat preservation, also a multi-county or bioregion. And then finally at the state level, something I'm working on with some of the legislative staff in California. Let's identify resilient communities as a statewide goal, and let's start creating a structure so that, and funding and legislation that enables capacity building in all the communities. We don't want resilient communities just to be for the affluent communities. We want everybody in the state to have the capability to implement community energy projects, to implement resilience projects. And so there's a role for state policy to make that happen. There's a need for state policy. So when we move to then the clean, sustainable, resilient 21st century electric system, taking back to electricity, 2 aspects that I'll reiterate. One is the building blocks, resilient communities, smart cities, local power systems based on renewable energy and storage, and they're designed to meet the needs of the community. They're designed for what climate zone they're in and what kinds of customer demographics. Integrated municipal systems, I mentioned that a few times, eliminating fossil fuels by electrifying everything and closing the loops, getting fuel, for example, out of the waste stream. And then ramping up renewable energy and building efficiency by integrating with electric and thermal storage and dynamic demand management. There's some good ideas in new construction for how to be really energy efficient and low carbon, but there's a lot of work to think about retrofits and making existing building stock cleaner. So with those building blocks, then the whole system decentralized and integrated at the same time. The layered architecture is the decentralized aspect, but even though that island capability exists at each level, they stay connected 99.99% of the time because they're interacting with the network. So now, instead of a power system that takes energy from giant power plants and sends it one way out to customers, now we have all of these entities all around the grid that are sometimes producing, sometimes consuming, and they're interacting in a network where there's a reasonable marketplace that makes sense to optimize efficiently how that whole system is functioning. So the island capability doesn't mean you leave the grid forever. It just means you can when it really becomes necessary. But most of the time, you're part of that system. The other thing is, in California, they've talked a lot about wanting to build transmission lines because there's huge wind resources in Wyoming and Montana. There's huge solar resources and wind in New Mexico. And how do we move those to where the load centers are? Well, if we really build up at this distributed level a whole lot more distributed resources, and we manage the shape of the electrification load so that it doesn't create really peaky load shapes at the transmission level, we end up with less congestion on the transmission grid. We end up with the ability to optimize resources around the western region without having to build huge, new, expensive transmission, simply because we get to use the existing assets more efficiently. Final thing, I'll mention resilience and sustainability because I think it is important to distinguish between those terms. When I use them, and in the last couple of slides, admittedly, I've mixed in some resiliency ideas and some sustainability ideas, but hey, stop that. Okay. Resilience is about the ability to deal with severe impacts of system damage that's already been done. We've done the damage in a lot of ways. The polar ice caps are melting, they're releasing methane, sea level is rising, we've got a gigantic island of plastic in the Pacific Ocean, and all those things. And there are impacts that will play out even if we stopped burning fossil fuels tomorrow. So resilience focuses on the near-term immediate needs, the terms like adaptation and preparedness. Whereas sustainability is about stopping further damage by ceasing and replacing the behaviors, but the mindsets and the cultural assumptions that actually drive me crazy. This is driving me crazy. That actually drive the damage. So last point, a quote from Buckminster Fuller, who inspired me many decades ago when I started reading his stuff. In order to change an existing paradigm, you do not struggle to try and change the problematic model. You create a new model. And I didn't touch anything. I did that. Create a new model and make the old one obsolete. And so along that idea, I've added this diagram from Kate Raworth, who wrote a book called Donut Economics, which I really like because she challenges the notion that economic growth is the supreme goal of all economic activity, and says, well, let's rethink that a minute. What is it that we want to accomplish with an economy? What should an economy accomplish? And she says, well, there's a social foundation where people need certain basic things, and that's the pink area on the inside. Water, food, energy, health, education, peace and justice, political voice, social equity, all of these things, where currently vast proportions of the population of Earth are underprovided of many of those things. And so that's the shortfall on the social foundation. And then you go on the outer circle and you look at the carrying capacity or ecological ceiling, and you see all those things around the outer pink area where we've overshot the capabilities of the ecosystems we live in. And notice that climate change is only one of those things. Climate change gets most of the headlines, but there is ocean acidification, chemical pollution, land conversion, fresh water, biodiversity loss, the rates of extinction, for example. So she said, well, how about if we rethink the purpose of the economy is to stay within the green zone and think about policies and economic mechanisms that bring us within that, that green zone as an alternative to simply producing growth, because we've seen that even in periods of economic growth, it doesn't necessarily help, and in fact may make a lot of those other things a lot worse. So food for thought, but the idea is a lot of the normal paradigms that we take for granted aren't necessarily the best path to the future that we're trying to accomplish. And so look for alternatives and think about them. And I think that's the end. Thank you. Yes, sir.
The two-way arrows that went from generation to distribution to use, the ones that were pointing back to the generating system, what does the generating system do with power that's brought to it? Can it absorb it?
Well, generally, yes. In a sense, on the bulk system, we've got this traditional distinction that this is a generator node and this is a load node. And the generator node means energy always comes in, or an import point, and the load node means energy always goes out. Well, it just means that the load node can sometimes look like a generator. And it's very common to have generators that produce more than they're scheduled. We have that with solar very often, where we have a day-ahead forecast of how much solar energy is going to come in. And it turns out when you get into the operating day, there's more solar than we expected, and the system has to accommodate it. So the system operator, their job is to balance supply and demand in real time and maintain this dynamic balance. So they have other generating plants that they can control, and if more starts coming in over here, then you tell this one to turn down and reduce its output.
I guess what I was thinking of was that actually this is happening in the distribution system, but not in the generating plants, that the generators can only have stuff going out.
Oh, the generating plants, yes.
Yes. So that all this balancing happens in the distribution, not in the generating or in the use. They need what they want. The generator can only produce, so all the balancing happens in the distribution. So that there is no double arrow going back to the first original.
There can be. I mean, that's.
What do they do with it? The power that comes in there.
I can answer that.
They reduce generation someplace else to balance it.
That sounds like a distribution function as opposed to.
No, it's so the definition of a balancing authority is that it maintains supply-demand balance dynamically all the time. That's at the ISO at transmission level. Okay. So if more energy is coming in someplace, they have to tell somebody else to reduce their output in order to maintain balance. Okay. And they have lots of ways to do that. You want to respond?
Yeah,
go ahead.
I actually know about, there are systems that can store excess energy and then release it later. And there's one specifically I know about in Scotland where when they have excess electricity, they pump water uphill. And then when they need the peak load, they bring it back downhill and generate. So that's where that energy can go. And as we get battery systems in place and such, that can happen more and more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm curious to your perspectives. I'm from Denmark, so based in Europe, where the discussion on resilience is completely absent, I would say. Is that because Americans are easy prey for hype, or the Europeans are maybe a bit slow in picking up new trends, or I have my own perspectives on that, but I'd be happy to hear yours as well.
Well, I don't know enough about Denmark to be able to make the comparison, but I think there's a couple of phenomena at play here. One is that there have been really severe disasters that have wiped out communities and large areas and have taken the electrical system with it. And for example, with Hurricane Sandy, there were places where microgrid facilities existed, like at Princeton University, where they had power, and it made a difference. And so just the visibility of those kinds of things leads people to think differently. Now, another phenomenon that drove federal level discussions, Department of Energy and FERC, was that the conventional generators, especially in the eastern ISOs and RTOs, that depend on spot market revenues, we're seeing their revenues decline. And that's because with more renewables, the prices are set based on the marginal production cost of the marginal generator. So when you see the marginal production cost going to zero for a lot of the resources, the prices start to fall, the revenue stream starts to fall, and so resilience became a kind of rationale to think of ways to give these generators more money. So, you know, some of these things are stretches of the word resilience, but there's also the actual experience of, especially at community level, the recent hurricanes.
Yeah, Lorenzo, with the movement from central station power towards more distributed architecture and such, where do you see the growth in jobs then? Because I would expect with a coal or a nuclear plant, you would have a lot of jobs and the city would benefit from the tax revenue and such. But what is the incentive for the city and the community officials with these distributed assets? My hypothesis being there's not enough jobs.
Well, I think building local resilience will give people jobs to do locally. If we were to, if say for example, if a city were able to implement a building retrofit program in their local area to make buildings more energy efficient, that's going to create local jobs. If they're building, say, a community level solar facility or solar plus storage facility, I think there's job opportunities that will come from, but they'll be based on local needs and customized energy systems, integrated energy systems with other facilities that'll be based on more local rather than working for, you know, a central station power plant.
Hi, April Salas with Tuck School of Business. I'm interested in your thoughts related to risk as we sort of increase electrification and plug loads and smart devices and electrification of nearly every system in order to meet some of our 2-degree scenario goals. We know electric reliability at the level that I think we've become accustomed to in the 99% range has a cost. So as we begin to electrify systems, transportation and otherwise, how do you think about risk?
So risk, you're talking specifically with relation to reliability?
Relation to sort of resilience and our lowered tolerance for grid outage, and if we have sort of a over-reliance on everything electric, you know, what sort of risk does that pose to the economy, to our systems? In fairness, I came from the Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability, where we talked about some of the, at the federal level, as we're talking about restoration of the system and where some of the major component parts are manufactured, for example, not all of that's made in the U.S. And so as we're thinking about our own system of systems and where all of these parts come from and how we ensure reliability, and we think about system resilience, it kind of, you know, as we're kind of walking through that supply chain, you know, it introduced some other risks. One of the other kind of interesting things about Sandy was some of the, you know, biofueled vehicle fleet that was able to evacuate people sort of out of the affected area. And that was an interesting conversation around sort of where gas stations were located as opposed to some of the other fueled fleets. So we're just thinking about sort of diversification versus total electrification. And we think about it in the lovely way that you've outlined, which I'm a big proponent of, but I often come back to the question of risk.
Well, we have very high reliability standards on transmission, but in practice, most of the outages that people experience are happening on distribution, right? And so there are different statistics about how you measure that. Shoring up reliability on the bulk system doesn't necessarily help with any of that. So that's one element. Another element is that, what was I going to say? Oh, DER, and especially storage and electronic digital control systems, enable a lot more customization of reliability levels by end-use customers. So the ability for customers or buildings or subdivisions or business parks to choose their level of reliability means that they can actually, by separating from the system or being the first to curtail or doing dynamic demand response, they can increase reliability on the system because they're more flexible. And I think a lot of the concern about the traditional way of thinking about reliability is, oh, when a person turns on the light switch, they want the lights to come on. And it's very much, here comes the demand, we need to build a system that can meet all of that demand all the time. Instead of, demand is now a dynamic participant in the market and it's actually responsive. So I think that's where a lot of the capability is going to come from, that resilience or reliability will be something that's more customized. Similarly, the idea of resource adequacy. How do we measure adequacy for a system? Well, the traditional definition is you take the peak system demand and you add a planning reserve margin of 50%, and then you stack up capacity until you get to that ceiling. Well, is that still the valid way to think about it when you've got a highly distributed system? For example, could a microgrid say, well, I've got 3 megawatts of load here, but I don't want to pay for resource adequacy capacity, I'll island. If the system's short, I'll just island and go off the system, and that becomes a substitute. So I think, not all this is figured out yet, but I think with the digitalization and with the ability to customize at the local level, demand to be a participant, that we'll have different approaches to manage that risk and probably can be more reliable than we are today.
As a political scientist, you've not talked about another kind of power, political power. People who've got money want it. For example, the oil industry is not going to go out of business. Mm-hmm. They're working very hard to slow change. Mm-hmm. What strikes me is that carbon dioxide emissions are at the moment producing global warming that is melting at a great speed. The polar ice caps and sea levels are rising. And you take a storm, and suddenly we've got mm-hmm. Houston and Miami, so that you've got these natural feedback loops that are faster, and our political process is glacial in its mm-hmm. movement. And the question is, how do you deal with those disjunctions in the systems that are out in those outer rings that have feedback loops all the way down through? Yeah. All I mean is that you got real problems where sometimes resilience happens because you got a crisis. Yep. A disaster, and that's beneficial. Because oddly enough, for example, one of the things you need in a market is obsolete firms have got to go bankrupt. Right. Otherwise, it's no damn good. And people who don't like to lose power, so you got to deal with this double kind of power. And all I mean is we're never going to get perfection. We just got to hope that we can. The resilience is that we use our brains to dig ourselves out of the catastrophes.
Yeah. Well, I think part of the response to that is community level resilience. There are things that we can do at a community level to be more capable of dealing with those things that are happening. And regardless of what ExxonMobil does in Congress, building greater resilience locally can improve the quality of life locally. I mean, it seems like it's not significant, but I think it is, because that really changes our thinking. We're used to thinking as rugged individuals. We're Americans, and I want, resilience means having a garage full of canned beans and guns and ammunition, but let's think differently about it, because you know, what is a satisfactory life? It's relationships. It's being part of a community and acting as a community. I think that's a hugely important aspect.
But also we got to be aware of these global things, because they're rising sea levels, which hit you at low-lying places wherever you are.
Yeah.
So, there's just continuously things we're going to have to keep on going back to the drafting board and being much more dynamic, and it's human nature doesn't like that.
So thank you so much, Lorenzo, for a stimulating talk as always. I want to follow up on April's question and bring in one of the political considerations. I've been in so many meetings with utilities and electric planners, and the thing that kind of stops everyone in our tracks oftentimes is the question of cybersecurity. And I heard that as a line in your risk conversation. I'm just wondering how you think about that, and how you think about that in relationship to the different grid architectures and how you see.
Okay, good. Yeah, good question. Well, I would make the assertion that the layered control system and layered architecture is more cyber secure, but that needs a little bit of unpacking. So a lot of people talk about the Internet of Things and all these devices that now are controllable from your cell phone. And gee, some hacker can get in and activate whatever, 500,000 thermostats and drive demand up and so on. And make massive amounts of toast, right? But I think that's where focusing on the interfaces and the responsibilities for this is, I think about it architecturally. In other words, going back to, I'll just put this, come on, you can do it. There. Architecturally, thinking about this, you would say, okay, what are the roles and responsibilities of the different entities in this diagram? And I'll just take, say, the big red one, the balancing authority, and then the local distribution area around that interface. And if you construct that interface relationship and have separability at that point, then that limits the ability to propagate something over a large area. And so it's really in this layered structure and architecture that I think gets a cybersecurity benefit.
So each of your yellow dots
Yeah.
becomes a place where you have kind of different cyber control architectures or something?
And you have one, standards of behavior that the entity on either side of that interface has accountability and responsibility to maintain. So it's like where you interconnect a device to the grid, there's certain rules about what it means to be a good citizen, the voltage impact you have, the current impact, et cetera. And if you add in then the capability of actually separating that element at that interface point, then that limits the propagation, I think, of cyber threats.
I think that highlights really the importance of the architecture and thinking about, back to your point at the very beginning, the
right.
safety demands.
Yeah, thinking about architecture, yeah.
I'd be interested in your comparison of what all of this means in the context of three very different state systems: a fully regulated electrical system like Georgia, a fully deregulated system like Texas, and then California, kind of a mix in the middle.
Okay, well, if all of those states are experiencing growth of distributed resources, and a lot of this action, say, happening at distribution level that's changing the electrical impacts, I think they'll all face the same problems from a technical perspective, right? The way it impacts the grid, the way it affects operations. Even in vertically integrated states and vertically integrated utilities that have not become parts of markets, I think for the most part, the guys that operate transmission, or guys and women that operate transmission, are not the same bunch of people that operate distribution. And they often don't have a whole lot of interaction between them because their operational modes are very different. Transmission still tends to be more of a mesh network. Distribution tends to be more radial. So I think that thinking architecturally about transmission distribution interfaces will probably be an issue everywhere that distributed resources are growing. Now, where there's market areas, wholesale market areas like California or the other ISOs, there will be the added pressure of distributed resources wanting to participate in the wholesale markets. And that was the big topic of FERC technical conference 2 weeks ago, right? That the DER aggregators want to earn wholesale market revenues. So I think that probably increases the pressure and urgency to think through TD coordination problems. But I think technically, you know, if the DER are growing and they're more diverse, they're going to have impacts on the system that follow the same laws of physics in all those areas.
Although they may not be growing.
Maybe, you know, it could be that some of those areas will slow the growth down, but, you know, there's, how much can they do that when individual customers say, I want to do this and you can't stop me? You know, there's a story, I listened to an interview a couple of months ago with a woman named Debbie Dooley in Atlanta who started the Green Tea Party. And she led a rebellion against the Georgia Public Utilities Commission that was trying to limit rooftop solar. And in her organization, they never mentioned climate change. They don't mention any of that stuff, but we have a right. It's our property. We can put solar panels on our roofs. You can't tell us we can't do it. And so those kinds of things can come from surprising quarters, even in the vertically integrated areas.
Any more questions?
Thanks. Maybe also a fact for context. I think, I don't have the numbers, I think the #1 source for outages in the US is squirrels. So not Russians, not storms, but
do they eat the wires, you mean?
Squirrels.
They bite?
I think they get in places where they shouldn't be, as far as I know.
Interesting.
So I don't know how to start there, but
well, we do have a problem. We have rats in California, and a lot of people put out poison to kill rats, and they end up killing owls and raptors because the rats get poisoned and then they die, and the raptors eat the rats and then they die. It's really terrible. So, you know, that kind of control, we need to rethink that also, because just poisoning them is not a good solution.
Thanks. I think I'm getting to my question now.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I thought it was what to do about the squirrels. Oh.
What you said about the structural issues and the regulatory issues really resonates with the research I've done for the last couple of months, where I've traveled around the Northeast to find out if distributed energy resources could maybe act more actively on the power markets to signals that might be provided by those. Basically dispatch their CHP capacity, for instance, to whatever needs there might be in the system. And I think what I found was that right now there is not much incentive for these guys to do that. They don't face wholesale power prices, not always at least. Yeah, their utilities might be disinterested, is the polite way of saying it, I think, in them doing something like that. And the tariff structures might not facilitate any kind of flexible interaction with the grid that could, on a whole, maybe make the grid more resilient. So I'm curious to hear what kind of proposal you have for maybe going forward in that direction, because what I found very much resonates with what you presented in your presentation, I think.
Well,
Thanks.
I think there are some untapped value for DERs that are untapped because we haven't yet figured out how to value them and compensate them. And in California, for example, there's an effort in one of the CPUC proceedings to encourage utilities to use DER to substitute for distribution upgrades, investing in distribution assets. Now, the paradigm is that utilities like to own assets because they get a guaranteed rate of return. So if they're procuring DERs under a contract basis, it's not an asset and they don't get a rate of return. The Commission's trying to figure out how to change that. I think that's going to be one of the significant values or benefits that DERs can offer in a way. Hosting capacity is an example. So the utilities now have to measure for every distribution circuit, how much more PV can you put on this circuit before you hit a limit such that in the middle of the day it's putting out energy, and it runs into hosting capacity limit. Well, if you add storage to your solar, you can put a lot more solar on because you're managing that high output level. But that's not compensated well yet. And so I think, you know, the way I look at it is, over the years we will see the real value of distributed resources is going to be distribution system benefits, end-use customer benefits, microgrids, local resilience benefits. Most of these things are not quantified yet. We don't know how to plug them into a cost-benefit assessment because we don't know how to put values on them. But I think that's going to, you know, that's parties are working on that, and I think that's the fruitful direction to go, probably more so than providing services to the wholesale market. Because with more renewables, the wholesale market revenues are going to change. You know, they're going to continue to decline as we get more renewables. So I think that's the place to look. Another way to think about that is how utilities recover the costs of their distribution system. And it's typically been through a volumetric per kilowatt hour charge. Now, if you've got the old paradigm, the one-way flow, big power plants and customers at the end and they just consume, then using a volumetric charge to recover fixed asset costs works okay. But if you get into a regime where now parties can put on stuff behind the meter and they're cutting down, well, then you start having a revenue shortfall for your distribution assets. How do we rethink then? How should we restructure distribution rates so that we're charging something that relates to cost causation? One way, possibly, to think about it is at each point of interconnection, charge you for distribution service based on your impact on the grid. So if you have a house with rooftop solar and you're putting a lot onto the grid and you're storing your energy there, you're going to pay more for distribution service than if you have solar with storage and your excess is being consumed, is being stored locally and not having an impact on the grid. Or if you have fluctuations in voltage, you're having more impact. The ISO has started doing something like that on transmission, where they procure flexible capacity, and that gets paid a certain amount to have this capacity available for fast ramping. And the cost recovery is charged based on parties' real-time deviations. So where there's load deviations, generator deviations that are real-time deviations from schedule, they pay for a cost causation share of that because they're having an impact on the system, they're driving the cost. So I think rethinking those rates is a crucial piece of it.
So Lorenzo, we have about 15 minutes left.
Okay.
I'd like to suggest that we also change the architecture of our seminar conversation from a one-way flow to bringing in some of the other perspectives of, I know we have we have MISO sitting here, and we have Anthony, who's worked at both PGM and ISO New England. I know you had a question, sir, but if we could, then think about like that last question. If you guys want to answer it from kind of your system architectures and how they're thinking about in these different regions of the country, that might be really useful also. So.
Sure. It seems like a fundamental disconnect has been between the wholesale markets and retail. A lot of work has gone in over the past 25 years to develop fairly robust wholesale markets, but mostly supply has been responding to real-time price signals. And demand has seen very little of those price signals. And so that seems to me like a key to unlocking the potential of distributed energy resources. And the fact that FERC is having this, so much work is going into, and it's happened in ISO New England, how do we integrate distributed resources into the wholesale market? That's like a workaround because we're not delivering those price signals to the retail market.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good observation. You're right. It's the retail rate making is still back in the last millennium. Yeah.
We're trying to change that locally,
but okay. You're up. Or Europe? Who wants to talk? I don't know. Anything. Anything. Just, you know.
I'll just follow up on a couple of comments you made about the signals not sending the right incentives to units. And that's something we're thinking about at PJM. How do we send the right incentives to units to provide the services we want? A lot of reliability services are not being compensated today. People aren't aware of that. Flexibility is not something we pay for. I know California has a product that compensates some type of flexibility. MISO has a product that compensates some type of flexibility. We don't have a product in PJM. ISO New England does not have a product. New York doesn't have a product. We don't pay units for flexibility, and that's something going forward as we get more and more renewables that ramp very fast. We might have to start finding a way to compensate resources for this flexibility or these other attributes, reliability attributes that aren't being priced in our markets. But how do we do that? What's the proper way to do it? How can we integrate? What's a meaningful price signal to send to these units? These are all different aspects that we're trying to think of right now to come up with. It's not an easy problem at all to try to price some of these different products or services and then to send the right signals to incentivize units, generators to actually provide it. Because right now, over the last 20 years, or since we've been basically these services have been provided for free, or at least the last 20 years that we've had markets, we've taken advantage of these services without compensating them directly. So how do we come up with meaningful signals that will incentivize units to provide these services, these reliability and resilience attributes to the grid? So.
Yeah, I think with that warm-up, at least now I can say a few things. Thanks, Anthony. From MISO perspective, it seems like distributed energy resources are not a big issue yet. We are mostly regulated states. We have a lot of 15 states and such. And so our basic constraint, if you will, on the system is more renewables. We are seeing more wind and solar in our system. And as a result, we're thinking about, do we have enough transmission to accommodate those renewables? We are currently at 8% energy-wise, and we think we will be at least 30% in future, which also adds to the gas infrastructure interdependency, because we are seeing a lot more gas on our system coming up. One estimate puts it around 40%. So we are not seeing as much penetration of distributed energy resources as California or New Jersey markets are seeing. But at the same time, we are participating in technical conferences such as FERC and trying to understand what those implications are. And our states mostly are taking the driver's seat, if you will, through the organization of MISO states to understand what visibility do we need and what sort of framework do they need to have in place to exchange information. Because at the end of the day, this question about the wholesale prices and retail prices, at the wholesale level, we have a single regulatory authority called FERC, but at the state level, we have multiple authorities. And in some states, it's a public utilities commission. In some states, it's a public service commission. In other states, like Iowa, it's economic development authority that takes a lead, if you will, in storage and such efforts. So we are dealing with multiple states. And in fact, some cities, like city of New Orleans, has its own jurisdiction, if you will. And so multiple actors, if you will, in that dialogue, and trying to bring them all together in a coherent fashion and understand what is the end goal, because resiliency would probably be the meaning would be different in the South, in New Orleans, Louisiana, and other states compared to the North of MISO, where there is more ice storms and stuff like that. So that's what we're dealing with. Yeah.
Except in the glass. Right? Yeah.
One of the things I think is so interesting about this issue is that we've talked about investor-owned utilities. We haven't really talked about munis and co-ops, which end up being important in the MISO area as well. But it's just how any solution that's created really is going to be fitting into such different areas, and so that kind of energy context. And something I've been thinking about for the last couple of years is that different parts of the country are really good at certain types of innovation and maybe not so good at others. And so when I think about, the superpower of MISO, for me, that multi-value plan where you've invested $5.2 billion on coordinated transmission planning and build is something that really hasn't happened, at least in PJM. And yet, when you think about like distributed, third-party distributed management, I mean, PJM has really been the leader in thinking about how you can think about demand response, bidding into markets. And in California, with all of the solar that state policies have built, you're really kind of setting the experimentation there. So when we're thinking about energy system evolution, it's not even. And there's different areas that have really a lot more experience than other things. And I'm just wondering, for all of you who have lived in this region longer than I have, what's the superpower of New England? What is this area really good at?
I'll just, the biggest issue that's faced New England is fuel supply issues over the past 5-10 years, and that's going forward, is fuel supply. New England's fleet is basically turned over to all natural gas and wind, predominantly renewables. And New England's like a little peninsula. It's at the end of the natural gas pipeline. So going forward, the biggest issue that they're concerned about is fuel security and getting actual fuel supply, especially during extreme weather events, such as during the winter, or if there's another polar vortex. Because basically, there's not enough capacity in the pipelines to supply the natural gas, and generators don't have incentives to purchase firm fuel supplies for their plants. They basically buy interruptible contract. They have interruptible contracts. So when something happens, they're the first ones to be interrupted. It's not the residential customers. It's the actual generators. So the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues facing New England, is fuel supply, and how that's their biggest concern. I don't think they have a solution yet. I know that's a huge concern for them right now. But
Well, and what feeds into that as well is you have shifting. You're dealing with concerns about fuel supply in New England. You're also dealing with incredible shifts in the states on the political spectrum, where sometimes it's difficult to cite infrastructure. Sometimes there are policies that encourage all sorts of distributed resources, generation, renewables, and then there's a sea change, from a political perspective, where all of a sudden that stops. So you have no infrastructure in areas, and then you have, a reduction in growth of some of these renewable resources, and it's the states are scrambling.
So what's New England good at? Don't all speak at once.
Skiing.
From an energy perspective, from like an innovation perspective, in the energy space.
I just want to say, I think it was last fall, there was a FERC technical conference where several members of the New England commissions presented, and basically their message to FERC was, we got this on a lot of the policy front because we're working together. So I think where New England is a very concentrated area and it's only 6 states, they do have the opportunity to coordinate, which is probably a little bit easier than a lot of the other regions. And I am a local New Englander, so I'm going to say that.
I second that. The states tend to work together. For example, even with transmission, they tend to share costs very well. As opposed to other regions of the country, it's a lot more friction. So I'd say the states are much more aligned politically and just than other areas of the country. Even in PJM, we have major factions which have very different perspectives on how you should go forward. We have coal-heavy West Virginia and Ohio, and you have renewable-friendly like Maryland, New Jersey now, and Delaware a little bit. So New England's more aligned, so they work together, I think, a little better than other areas of the country, even though they are separate states, as opposed to California, which is a single state, or New York, which is a single state. They don't have these multi-region issues. So
there's also been, there's also RGGI, right? And I think at the state level in New England, we've seen a lot of an advancement, the uptake of solar in Massachusetts and Vermont, especially. So I think at the state level, there's quite a bit of innovation there, and then this cooperation as well. I think those are all good points.
I'd add. The role of hydro is also an element in New England, and I think the integration with the Canadian hydro system is on the rise. Massachusetts has just made a decision to buy more Hydro-Quebec electricity, and that's far and away the largest renewable today in New England. How that gets blended into the system, how it can serve to firm up the rising amounts of solar and wind. I think that's an important one. It also has a real strong reliability aspect to it, particularly with this fuel. Some of the fuel shortages we have in New England, you can turn that system on in ways that we wouldn't otherwise be able to.
I see April behind you shaking her head.
Oh, I'm becoming a little too dismayed. I ran the State Energy Assurance Program at DOE in the Office of Electricity, and I've had the pleasure of being in New Hampshire for the last 2 years and getting to see firsthand how the sausage is made. And while I think there's a lot of civility in the discourse and a lot of, the states are coming together well, it's been a little bit interesting to see how decisions are made and accorded. Seeing it at the federal level across the states and the regions has been interesting. Seeing it up close and personal as a member of the planning board here, how town by town, municipality by municipality in New Hampshire alone is a different regulation per town, municipality, city. Even the city of Lebanon and the town of New Hampshire or Hanover have different, sort of rules of the road. Also looking at how the Northern Pass project has really stalled, and that wonderful, Canadian hydro can't get to anyone else south of Maine. Similarly, with transmission congestion related to the wind capacity that Maine is also producing. New Hampshire's even tried to host solar systems for Massachusetts. That didn't go very well. Nobody wants the natural gas pipeline extensions except the state. The state just came out with its 15-year plan saying we're going to be a natural gas state. We're also going to continue to rely on nuclear until it's no longer here. And the best energy efficiency, or the best sort of sustainability and clean energy implementation we can work towards is efficiency, because it's the cheapest and it's the easiest. And so that's an interesting signal partnered next to Vermont, has a very different level of discourse, where you look sort of south of us into Connecticut and Rhode Island, who are doing really interesting microgrid projects and pilots. Massachusetts, which is playing around with sort of the planning and pricing. So I've seen a lot of discontinuity within such a small region, even though I think the level of civility and discourse around how to come together and the fact that we need to come up with a solution has been the forefront. I haven't seen sort of good, meaningful progress being made towards some cohesive regional policy.
There's one comment here, and then I'll let Lorenzo have the last word after this comment.
I was going to say, going back to antiquity, New England was very different when I was growing up in the 30s and 40s. This really matters because it has to do with that individualism. That is, the key thing for stability of heating systems was wood in your fireplace. That is to say, the individual family had a lot of flexibility because we were so traditional in our
energy.
What?
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things being splitting wood.
Yeah.
So Lorenzo will give you the last word, and then I know your mother probably told you never eat cookies for dinner, but we have a lot of them out there. So consumption with 2 hands.
But eat them with vegetables, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So we'll have kale and broccoli with the cookies. Well, I don't know what more to add as the last word. I think perhaps some of this individualism and differences from one state to another and one community to another can be a virtue, because developing local community level resilience and local power systems is going to be cheaper than ever as costs continue to come down. And, I don't know, Anthony, how much the issues you raise about fuel security in the winter could be solved, or at least mitigated to some extent, by community level energy systems where you have solar and you have storage and you use thermal storage in houses and other things. So, I think those kinds of things have merit. And when I look at the major institutions like the Congress, for example, and think about how are they going to help us be more resilient, I think, well, it's really up to us at the local level to figure out solutions to these problems. So I guess that's where I'd end.
And that's it. So we're 6 o'clock. So I like to run my trains on time.
Thank you.